All right, listen up. Today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite all-time weird stories in history. It's the story of the Pickled Pioneer. Welcome to Whispery History. Actually, the story of the Pickled Pioneer is less about the actual Pickled Pioneer, Willie Kyle. It's more about his father, Wilhelm Kyle. Dr. Wilhelm Kyle to many. Or sometimes Father Kyle, King Kyle, Reverend Kyle. He's been called a lot of things, influenced by his many jobs. He was a tailor, he was a pharmacist, a folk healer, a reverend. He was a cult leader. Mostly a cult leader. Wilhelm Kyle was born in Prussia, modern-day Germany, and at a young age, according to what he said later, he was told by a Romani fortune teller that he was going to find his fate in America. This was just going to be the first of many prophecies that defined Wilhelm Kyle's life. Now, as a young man, Wilhelm Kyle started off in Prussia as a tailor. It was the family business, and he was an apprentice. That's where he met his wife. But Wilhelm Kyle had been given a prophecy, and so, together with his wife, he moved to New York City, New York, where he supported himself and his wife as a tailor at first. But then he became sort of a folk healer and a pharmacist, because it was the 1800s, so why not? Anybody could do anything. License? What license, please? Anyway, with that skill under his belt, he soon moved to Philadelphia to open up his own drugstore. While he was in Philadelphia, he got up to examining his own belief system and questioning organized religion, as a lot of people were doing at the time. It was a period known as the Second Great Awakening. And this was interesting because he was, actually, at that point, a Methodist preacher. He'd ended up criticizing a lot of the paid clergy, a lot of the Christian denominations, and a lot of institutionalized religions. And he ended up distancing himself from his own congregation, and then from the Methodist Episcopal Church entirely. Which is not to say that he gave up on preaching. He did not. He kept preaching. He ended up creating his own belief system and his own congregation. It was different. He said that he was a prophet, and that he was going to be a martyr during the Last Judgment. Oh, and he had a date for the Last Judgment. He had had a vision that it was going to happen in 1844. That would have been the Judgment Day. Now, around this same time, while he was living in Philadelphia, he ran into and became friends with some people who had been members of a group called the Harmony Society. They were a religious sect associated with a number of communes. They had become disillusioned with the leader of that group, and they were trying to start their own commune called the New Philadelphia Society. He asked them questions, he talked to them, learned about communal living, he learned what to do, he learned what not to do. And he absorbed some of those former members of the Harmony Society and added them to his current congregation as he incorporated some of the things that he'd learned from them. Soon enough, he had his own commune. And just in time, too, because 1844 had come and Judgment Day had not arrived. He needed new recruits. Oopsie. He somehow, though, convinced his congregation members that it was a corrupt world out there and they needed to separate themselves. So despite his prophecy not having come true, he managed to influence them to all remove themselves from society and establish the Bethel Colony Commune out west in Missouri, where they became known as the Bethelites. There, in his commune, they would separate themselves from the world almost. They did still have to trade with the world for the things that they needed, that they couldn't make themselves. As a group, they had a few trades that they specialized in. They were good furniture makers. They also made whiskey, and they farmed. They called the whiskey Golden Rule whiskey, which was one of their main tenets of the commune. Follow the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Soon enough, they were going to be taking the Golden Rule to a really, really weird level. But we'll get to that soon enough. As communes go, the Bethel colony was doing pretty well. Some members began to lose faith, what with the whole no judgment day thing, but the commune was pretty viable. It was a pretty viable community. So even when some of the original members bowed out, they still stuck around. They lived in the community. Wilhelm had gone so far as to create little satellite communes nearby in Missouri. Kyle was getting a little bit, cult leadery. He started referring to himself not so much as a prophet as an incarnation of Christ. He started calling himself the Central Sun, and he called his flock the princes and princesses of light. Because you want to make people loyal to you, call them princes and princesses. Make them princesses and princesses. They'll stick with you. I'm sure it made them feel good. But then there was also this whole self-deification thing, right? I mean, he's calling himself the Christ now. And he made his kids deities. They had holidays based on their birthdays that were right up there with Christmas and Easter and the Pentecost. Keep in mind, this is also a commune, so people are all working and contributing, and all of their assets are pooled together. Ideally, each person is getting what they need and contributing what they can. Most people have equal size houses according to their needs. Yeah, you got 2 kids of different genders, you got a 3-bedroom house, right? You receive equal benefits as your neighbor. But then, of course, that's when you're all princes and princesses of light. When you are the Central Sun, well, no ordinary house is going to do, is it? That's when you get a mansion built for you, made by your members. And he also had additional homes in each of those satellite communities that he created. There were other little discrepancies between what he preached and what he did. For instance, Reverend Kyle told his members of his flock to be celibate. The dude had 9 kids. And while his flock were hardworking and industrious, working the fields, creating the furniture, making whiskey, or raising children, he didn't do a whole lot of hands-on manual labor like that. Now, that kind of behavior doesn't stand up to a whole lot of scrutiny by people who don't believe that you're the deity. So that could be why, by 1854, Wilhelm Kyle was again worried about the outside world contaminating his flock. Once again, he decided that it was time to move out west. He sent scouts out to find a good place to settle. His scouts went out to Washington Territory and came back to him with news of the Willapa Valley. And that is when Wilhelm Kyle had yet another vision. That he would lead his colony to the promised land, the New Eden. He had a son. His oldest boy was Willie, a teenager. He'd never really led a wagon train before. But he had asked and begged and pleaded with his father that he be able to lead the wagon train out west to the promised land. And Wilhelm Kyle prayed and pondered, and then he had another vision that they would make it to the promised land with his son Willie leading the way. So Willie started practicing with the ox cart. He was very excited. Preparations were made, supplies were gathered. People said goodbye to their friends and their family who were going to be staying behind. And in May of 1855, the Bethelites prepared to head west to Washington, following Willie Kyle to the Promised Land. But, as with a few of Wilhelm Kyle's prophecies, there was a little bit of an oopsie. Willie Kyle, who was supposed to lead the way according to the prophecy, Willie Kyle, he got sick and died 4 days before they were supposed to go. So, yeah, there was that. But a prophecy is a prophecy. And Wilhelm Kyle had promised his son that he would be able to lead the way to the Promised Land. So those great furniture makers made themselves a great casket. And they sealed it with pitch. And once they did that, they put poor Willie Kyle in, and they covered him. They covered him with Golden Rule whiskey. They put him in a cart in the front wagon, and they followed that Golden Rule west, with Willie Kyle leading the way, floating around, bobbing around, sloshing around, but leading the way nonetheless, leading the way to the Promised Land. And they set off to the sound of music from their own marching band, because, one other thing that the Bethelites were known for, and remained known for years later, their music. They had a brass and string band, and they played as they set off on their travels west. Yeah, they had flutes and zithers and something called a Schellenbaum, which is like a percussion instrument. It doesn't look like an instrument, it looks decorative. It's sort of a half circle thing on a pole with bells on it that you jingle. And anyway, it was a sight to behold. And they were singing hymns. Because also, now this wagon train is now a funeral procession, so they had hymns to go with it. Dr. Kyle wrote, or actually, he said he wrote, a hymn for his son called Das Grab ist tief und still. I think it's the grave is quiet and still. Anyway, yeah, sure, maybe. But also, there was a song, a hymn by the same name, written by the guy who wrote Ave Maria. He wrote it when Dr. Kyle was 5 years old and living in the general vicinity that it was written. So maybe he wrote it. Maybe. Maybe he wrote Das Grab ist tief und still, but maybe he was just accidentally rewriting Schubert. Yeah. Now, they're setting off on their funeral procession / wagon train west. And any of us who have played the Oregon Trail growing up, we know the usual hazards, right? There's cholera and being bitten by a snake. And crossing rivers is a problem. In the real Oregon Trail, that was actually a big one. One that doesn't come up as often in the game is being attacked by Native Americans. And there were the occasional skirmishes. Traveling the Oregon Trail was always dangerous, but at this particular time especially. Tensions between the Native Americans and the European immigrants and their descendants, or the descendants of European immigrants that were traveling west, they were tense. In Oregon, the Cayuse Indian War had just recently ended. The Rogue River Wars were just beginning. In Wyoming, the Croatan Massacre by Fort Laramie was about to start off what would be a decades-long battle. For the most part, it didn't happen as often as we perceive it from the Old West movies. It was really a pretty rare occurrence, but it did happen. 400 people were killed traveling west on the Oregon Trail, and most of them were killed during the 1850s. when this wagon train was heading west, with Willie Kyle leading the way. It was certainly a frightening specter for those who were traveling west on the Oregon Trail. But not for Wilhelm Kyle and his Bethelites, because they had been promised safe passage with Willie Kyle leading the way. Well, prophecy or not, the Kyle party did find themselves in a bit of a sticky situation one morning when they woke up along their wagon train and found that they were surrounded by Native Americans. Now, they had been warned. The Kyle party, as they'd set off across Missouri, they started to run into people on their way back east who were telling them that the Sioux were getting all fed up, that they had had their hunting grounds encroached upon and disturbed enough, and their traditional homelands were being disturbed. And of course, Europeans also brought disease that they weren't necessarily immune to, so they were really ready to stop white people from coming west. But of course, Wilhelm Kyle wasn't bothered. He had seen the prophecy. God would watch over them. They would be protected as they crossed the promised land. So it was mid-June. They'd just gotten past Fort Kearny. They were really strongly advised to turn back. They wake up in the morning, they see a small band of Sioux approaching as they're singing their hymn along with their horns and their strings. It was certainly music that the Sioux hadn't heard before, and that could be why, when the small band of Sioux approached, they didn't attack. They instead gestured to ask to see what was in that weird box in the front of the wagon. Huh? And Reverend Kyle was so happy to oblige. He cracked open that casket and let those Native Americans take a look inside. Willie Kyle sloshing around in the whiskey. They were understandably stunned, the Native Americans, especially with the music and the strange instruments. I mean, they had scissors, they had the bells, they had the guitars, they had a tuba. Can you imagine the first time you've seen a tuba? That alone has got to be pretty weird, right? And that was just where it started. You start with the tuba, you end up with the Pickled pioneer sloshing around in the casket. Suffice it to say, they wanted to share this with their friends and family. They encouraged the Bethelites to keep singing, to bring their wagon train back to the Sioux village, where they were treated as guests. And not just treated as guests, they were treated as honored guests. They were treated as friends. They were fed. They were given provisions. They were even given hosts to guide them to the next leg of their journey. The Bethelites traveled on after staying with their Native American hosts, and they traveled forward. By the time they got to Fort Laramie, the commandant was really insisting that they stay there or turn back east, because according to him, it was not safe. Keep in mind, they're just about to kick off a decades-long battles, right? He insisted that the Sioux would attack them, but Kyle said, no, he's good. After a good night's rest, they all fuck off out of Fort Laramie and head back on the trail, singing, and Willie Kyle sloshing. Once again, they come across more Native Americans. This is where they wake up. They're absolutely surrounded by all angles. Warriors at the top of ridges, and they're threatening them. But Dr. Kyle isn't afraid. He approaches them. And now he knows the trick. Now he's saying, come on over. Take a look at what I got. He brings them over to that first wagon. The music plays. The casket is cracked open to the awe and amazement of the Native Americans, who bring them back to their village again, feed them, treat them as guests, give them provisions, and then send them on their way with an escort for the next part of the journey. This happened again and again. If you've played Oregon Trail, you know what it's like. By the time you're in Wyoming, you're running low on supplies. That did not happen to the Bethelites. These idealistic idiots are actually Mr. Magooing their way across the Oregon Trail, and they managed to do so safely and in relative comfort. 6 months after they set out, just as winter was descending upon them, the 34 wagons full of Bethelites, led by Dr. Kyle and his sloshing son Willie, made it to the Willapa Valley, where he was buried on a hill, so that he could look down on all of the homes below. They had made it to the Promised Land. They had had safe passage, with Willie Kyle leading the way. And, according to one truly horrifying account I'd heard but have not had the nerve to substantiate, the party arrived to the Promised Land just in time, because they were almost out of whiskey in the casket. And I am not saying that it evaporated. One final debunking of Wilhelm Keil's prophesizing. The Promised Land turned out to be not so promising. The place where they'd found their new Eden had nobody around to buy their furniture and booze. And the soil wasn't good for growing the kind of crops that they were familiar with. So the next year, they had to move down to Oregon, where there were actually people. They did better there. They set up another commune. They named it Aurora, after Kyle's daughter. And, yeah, it's still there today. Well, the city. It's not a commune now. They're all capitalists now. Years later, Dr. Kyle, Reverend Kyle, King Kyle, whatever you want to call him, he wrote about his journey west. And he is convinced that the reason he had such safe passage was because the indigenous people that he ran into could see the goodness in his heart, the kindness. He's basically saying that they recognized him as the deity that he was. He honestly doesn't seem to have recognized that he was a traveling freak show. But there you go. That was it. That was the story, sort of the Pickled Pioneer. Thank you all for checking out this whispery history.